Hello, here I am to talk to you about grid in questions. There are plenty of grid in questions on both sections of the math, the calculator section and the non-calculator section. And so I wanted to kind of review, because I'm skeptical sometimes as how well people are reading through the directions for this. And there are points that can be lost simply because you may have the right answer, but you grid them in incorrectly. So we just want to touch on some points about this so that we make sure that we get as many points as we can as we are working through the PSAT or the SAT. As I'm looking through the directions, the first thing that stands out to me is this part right here. You will receive credit only if the circles are filled in correctly. So if you're not bubbling in correctly, you're not going to get credit. Even if you write your answer up here correctly, if you don't bubble it in correctly, you're not going to get the points. No more than one circle in any column. No question has a negative answer. So if you get a negative answer for one of these bubble in grid questions, go back and check your work, because it's going to be wrong. It's not going to be negative. We're going to talk about number 4. Some problems may have more than one correct answer. You can only grid one if that's the case. Mixed numbers, very important piece right here. You can't put it in like this, because that's 31 halves, not 3 1/2. So make sure that you either change it to a decimal or a fraction, an improper fraction, before you bubble that in. And decimals, we're going to talk about that. That's right over here, right next to that, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Real quick, what these look like. I have a fraction line. Notice that there's only 2 fraction circles in there, because I can't start and I can't end a fraction with a fraction bar. Decimals, I can start or end with either one. You don't necessarily need to end a number with a decimal point, but you can. It won't be counted wrong if you do. If you are putting in a repeating fraction like 2/3, then you can either put it in as the fraction. You could even start it on this side and then start it right here, but that's up to you. Just make sure you're bubbling correctly. You can put it in as 0.666 or 0.667. Make sure that you are filling the entire grid, though. You cannot do 0.6. You cannot do 0.7, even though it rounds to that. You cannot do 0.66, and you cannot do 0.67, because you end up with an empty spot in the grid. If you are truncating or rounding, and this is truncating, means you just cut it off, and this is rounding, which means you're looking at the next digit and see if it rounds up or stays the same, then you have to fill the whole grid. If you don't, it's going to be counted as wrong, and let's not make that mistake. This last piece is that you can either right or left justify. This is left justified, which means my last digit is in the left. This is right justify. My last digit is in the rightmost box. This is left justify, meaning my first digit is in my leftmost box. And now let's do a little bit of a practice and see how we can grid, and maybe an example or two of what we can't do. So if I'm going to solve this first one, number 14, then what I want to do is solve for what value of h is 24 equal to h divided by 10 minus 6. That's what that says. So if this thing, h divided by 10 minus 6 is equal to 24, then that part, h divided by 10, has to equal 30, because 30 minus 6 is 24. You could also do that by adding 6 to both sides, just like you do in your math class. So then I think about this and I say, all right, well, change my color. If some number divided by 10 is 30, that number is going to have to be 300. You could also multiply by 10. That's what they teach in the math classes. Multiply by 10. So when I grid, I only grid the number. I don't grid the h equals. You don't see any letters here or anything like that. So I could do, 300 like that, and bubble in 3, 0, 0. I could do it that way. That's left justified. And then I could do right justified, which means my last digit's going to be all the way to the right. And I could do 3, 0, 0, like that. Where sometimes people wind up in a little bit of trouble is when they forget where they're lining up their numbers. So for instance, I might see like 3, 0, and 0. And when that happens, the problem there is that I have this whole column right here between two digits, and this would be wrong. They would count that as wrong. Even though you have the 300 correct at top, they don't count that. They count how you bubble. So you need to make sure that you are bubbling correctly. Another mistake that I've seen happen before is that people just kind of get careless, and even though they may have the right place to bubble, they see 3, and instead of doing the zeros, they do like the decimal points instead, because they're just being a little bit careless in where they're bubbling. And that also would be counted as wrong, because it's not 3 decimal point, it's 300. So you got to make sure that you are paying attention to what is going on underneath your numbers. Make sure you're lining everything up, and you should be fine. So go ahead and practice that one, bubble that one in. And then what I would like you to do is those other 3 problems, and take a look at what those look like when they're bubbled in. The correct answers and the correct and some incorrect ways of bubbling those will be shared on the last screen. So good luck, everybody, on the PSAT or the SAT, whichever you happen to be taking on April 10th.